So the best way to understand what distraction is to understand what distraction is not. And to do that, we have to start with where the word comes from. So the word distraction comes from this Latin root trahare, which means to pull. And if you notice that the opposite of distraction is not focus. Many people say, I don't want to be distracted, I want to be focused. But that's not the opposite of the word. The opposite of distraction is traction. That both words end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action, reminding us that distraction is not something that happens to us. It is an action we ourselves take. So we have traction, we have distraction. Traction is any action that pulls us towards what we say we're going to do, things that move us closer to our values, help us become the kind of person we want to become. Those are acts of traction. The opposite of traction, distraction, is any action that pulls us away from what we plan to do, farther from our goals, farther from becoming the person we want to become. So this is really important. This isn't just semantics, because I would argue that any action that you do with intent, anything that is planned ahead, anything that involves forethought, is traction. So there's a lot of talk today about how, social media is melting our brains and video games are bad for you. I don't agree. I think that anything that you plan to do with your time and attention, as long as it's done with intent, is fine. That becomes an act of traction, as long as it's planned for with intent. As Dorothy Parker said, the time you plan to waste is not wasted time. Now, just because something is a work-related task doesn't mean it's not a distraction. In fact, that's the worst kind of distraction, because these distractions trick you into not even realizing you're getting distracted. I'll give you a perfect example. For years, I would sit down at my desk. I would take out my to-do list. By the way, we can talk about later why to-do lists are one of the worst things you can do for your personal productivity. We can get to that. I would sit down at my desk and I would say, okay, I've got that big project that I need to work on right now. Nothing's going to get in my way. I'm going to stay focused. Here I go. I'm going to get started. But first, let me check some email, right? Let me just scroll that Slack channel. Let me just do that one thing on my to-do list, that easy task, just to get started here, just to get the rhythm going, right? It's a work-related task. And when I didn't realize that that is the most pernicious form of distraction, the distraction that you don't even realize is happening. Because if it's not what you said you were going to do in advance within your time and attention, it is by definition a distraction, right? So what we tend to do is we prioritize the easy work. We prioritize the urgent work as opposed to the hard and important work we have to do to move our lives and careers forward. So just because it's a work-related task doesn't mean it's a distraction. That's the most awful type of distraction. It's not the video games. It's not the social media. It's the distractions we don't even know are distracting us from what we said we would do with our time. So now we've got traction, we've got distraction. Now the other two parts of the model involve what we call triggers. Triggers are these things that prompt us to action. We have two kinds of triggers. External triggers are things in our outside environment. These are things that we tend to blame, like cell phones and our computers and all the pings, dings, and rings in our life. But studies find that those account for only 10% of our distractions. Only 10% are caused by these external triggers. So what's the other 90%? 90% of the time that we get distracted, it's not because of what's happening outside of us, it's because of what's happening inside of us. These are called internal triggers. Internal triggers are these uncomfortable emotional states that we seek to escape. And so that's the first step to becoming indistractable, and answers your question around why, by and large, even though despite knowing what to do, we don't do it, it's because all of these problems are an emotion regulation problem. That in fact, time management is pain management. I would argue weight management is pain management. Money management is pain management. In fact, all human behavior is about a desire to escape discomfort. And then answers your question around why don't we just do what we say we're going to do? It's because we don't realize that these are always emotion regulation problems. So that's the first step to becoming indistractable, is mastering the internal triggers. Then the second step, we talked about traction earlier, making time for traction. The third step, hacking back the external triggers. And then finally, preventing distraction with pacts. And so that's the model, these 4 steps. And then of course we can go in as much depth as you like. But if you understand these 4 fundamental steps, and this is what took me 5 years writing this book, namely because I kept getting distracted, right? I was very distractible myself, and I wrote the book for me, as I mentioned earlier. But it was when I boiled down the hundreds of studies and research, and you can see there's 35 pages of citations in the book. It wasn't until I could kind of solidify this model that I could make it practical enough to change lives. It certainly did mine.